So yeah, I changed the title from kind of a jokey title to something a little simpler and possibly better. Okay, so who am I? I'm Max. I work at this company, NodeSource. I've been there for over 3 years. Our flagship product is this wonderful thing called NSolid. It's an enterprise-enhanced version of the Node runtime.
It's good. It's good.
Okay, that's reverberating in my ears. I gotta kind of get away. All right. So it's an enterprise-enhanced version of Node. It's got a beautiful dashboard that I've worked on for over 3 years, written in React. And we really push the browser really hard. That center screenshot, it has this little component in it called the scatter plot. That thing is rendered in WebGL. It supports up to something like 5,000 process dots. Each one of those little dots is a Node.js process running in a container somewhere in the cloud. And we have a visualization that graphs like there's CPU usage versus a heap and stuff like that. On the left is a CPU profile visualization that you can get through this thing. And anyway, the whole point of all of this is just I've run into a ton of browser warts in these last few years. Every one you can imagine. Okay, so I've spent a lot of time thinking about how to improve my lot in life. How to make browsers into a better application platform. Instead of being bitter, I struggled hard to make this talk not about being bitter, but about showing a better way forward, or maybe a slightly better direction. So I'm going to talk about 5 things today. What's wrong with browsers, what we can do about it. I'll demo a prototype of a thing I've been working on this summer. Then talk about a few future directions that it could go in, and then to take hopefully 10 minutes worth of questions from everybody, probably more. All right, so browsers way back in the day began as document viewers with hyperlinks. Think of Mosaic and Netscape in 1993, 94, when just rendering a JPEG was magic. And so since then, browsers have evolved. They keep adding features to bridge this gap between this document-centric model, all the APIs and things like that, to support more and more needs of visual applications. And what do people do on the web these days? They don't read documents. I mean, maybe a little Wikipedia and this kind of thing, but even that has some kind of application-like features in it. Okay, so there's a lot of other issues in this. Okay, oh wait, last 2 points. So the result of all of this morphing from this document to application model, has produced standards that really aren't good for application authors. So React basically gets you around DOM issues. There's tons of libraries that'll wrap CSS, so you don't have to touch CSS yourself. A bit of what's coming in the talk here is some stuff with SVG, where I'm kind of doing some of the similar stuff. And one of the reasons that we actually care about this today is that all of these standards end up leading to broken workflows, where designers and engineers working in applications aren't really able to do things as quickly and as nicely as they ought to be able to do. All right, so here's a slide talking about some stuff. I bet a lot of people here know what the block of code on the top does. That's how you draw an up arrow in CSS. The first time I saw this 15 years ago, was it 15? A long time ago, I saw this and didn't understand how it worked and thought it was a horrible hack, and I still think it's a horrible hack, but it's what you're supposed to do. There's some SVG with the React syntaxy things in it. That also draws a triangle. And so okay, they both do the same things. It's a heck of a lot easier to write a graphical editor that deals with a vector-based standard, something built from the ground up to do that, like SVG. You're not going to go into InDesign or Sketch and and have the thing save all of that artwork in CSS. I mean, you probably could, but it's not really the best idea. Okay, so what we need is to start with a base that's more like this vector graphics world and not this CSS box model. Okay, so here's a slide about the flow thing that I was talking about. So typically, I do a lot of things. I'm not just a front-end person. Um, what happens is, that's Paul DeVay at NodeSource. He's the director of design there. He's an amazing designer. But anyway, I grabbed this picture and I stuck it in my slides. So Paul makes a dolphin, and he wants me to make a dolphin app. And one of my jobs is to turn that into some CSS. Paul changes his mind. He wants a shark now. But I've drawn, like I've put effort in to make some CSS that's dolphin shaped, and I've got to figure out how to take that CSS dolphin and turn it into something else. And it's that thing I was talking about in the previous slide about that it not being the best way to store this information. That's why you don't really get good visual editors doing CSS editing. I have that same problem because when I have to touch that stuff, I'm just as befuddled. And we're not even talking about all the quirks and stuff, some of which still exist. So this is kind of a broken flow. I don't want to be doing that. I don't want to waste my time drawing pictures and changing views. I want Paul to do that and to manage his own edits. OK, let me make sure. So yeah, I struggle to map that existing work back into the form needed to make changes. And that's a lot of pain. OK, the way it should work is Paul should say, well, here's the dolphin, send it to me. I wired that view up in the rest of the application. Do the work that I actually like to do. Those views should be directly usable in that form. I shouldn't have to translate them. And incidentally, before the web, we had this with Next Step, an interface builder. And I guess on Windows, they had various things like Visual Basic that let you drag and drop widgets on a place, and you could directly manipulate things. Anyway, I think that's really great. So if he wants to change a thing, I don't have to get wrapped up in the details of that view, hopefully. OK, so the view should be separate so the design tool can make tweaks. OK, so how do we do that? Well, there's a bunch of bad options. We could stop writing web software and write desktop software again. But that really can't work because the web, I think the actual saving grace, or not the saving grace, but the thing that made the web popular was the zero install thing the web platform gave you. So we can't get away from that. We can't just put up the warts because that's what we're doing now. Building a brand new web platform, that's like boiling the ocean. Nobody's going to do it. But we can do a thing where we take a subset of the web APIs and choose to only use those to constrain ourselves for benefits. And I think that has a lot of promise, and a lot of the web kind of grew that way. And of course, there's historical examples like Carbon on Mac OS. So if you take your old Mac app and you wanted to run it on OS 10, you would use this Carbon thing that would make it so you would do less changes to your app, and you could bring it forward. So we're getting really close to me showing my prototype. And I decided to build it with React and SVG. I used React because it gets you over the DOM issues, and it's kind of a de facto standard. And with SVG, it's a good enough standard, a good enough thing to render against. And it's not perfect. There's a couple of issues with it. If you've ever tried to build a user interface with SVG, and you want like a rect or a circle or something to take a click, and you want the thing right underneath it to also take that same event, there's a lot of bad hacks you got to do to make that work. I even saw an academic paper. Somebody published a paper about doing that and like how to do it. And the other issue is text doesn't wrap in SVG. So these are both things that I dealt with in the system by building an event system. So I actually track all of the shapes that are on the screen, or at least all of the rectangular ones right now, because I haven't actually fleshed it out and done supported paths and things like that. And the other thing I added is code that wraps text, so you get that nice text flow thing. OK, so now it's time for a demo. And I should caution, this thing is not a thing that I'm trying to get everybody to use or start writing their applications in right now. It's so early and buggy, and you'll see all the stuff. This is just, my goal ultimately would be to get somebody to help me build this thing and to push it further. So it's definitely not ready for use. So let me shut this demo down, or shut that down and get to the demo. OK, there's my window. Now I need that mirroring mode. OK, so here's an ordinary browser window. Did I move it into the right place?
You can change the mirror mode.
Yeah, Command F1. Oh, wait. Command F1. Ooh, I have to hit Fn. OK. OK, hey, that works. Oh, yeah, that's nice. Thank you. All right. So what are we looking at? This is, let me refresh that. Yeah, that's a browser window, right? OK, so I'm going to go and try to just set the stage here by opening up the Chrome DevTools. That's not what I wanted to happen. It's cutting off. It's full screen on my monitor, but not on the TV. That'll work. OK, so if we drill into the DOM on this thing, I think this is probably the best way to demo this. Ooh, shoot, that's really hard to read. There we go. So we've got like a little bit of the body. It's a React app. And everything else inside here is a pile of SVG. And everything you're going to see on the screen tonight is all done in SVG. There's not a single ordinary HTML or CSS thing in here. None of it. OK. So that's the first point to start out with. The second is that it's a brand new system. It's not compatible with anything, and it doesn't use anything, and all of that. OK. So this screen has a big container that's attached to the edges of the screen, right? We'll get into what that is in a sec, but it's there. The other thing to note here is I've done a thing that's kind of like Flexbox. So I've got this line here. And on that line, I can go and attach shapes. So yeah, I dropped the star in there. Let's see. I'll put it in this mode. I could drop another one in there and keep going down the line. So this shape is not limited to a box model. You can take these points and edit them, drag them around, and do stuff. Let's see, if you don't like them packed on that side, you can flip them around. So if we flip our vector the other way, or this ray the other way, we can flip it around and get it to pack on the right. I've got the space evenly button. So you can go and tell this thing. We're basically setting props on this layout component and telling it to go and change some of these things. The distance that's set when you pack this thing on one side is controllable. But I just haven't built the editor out sufficiently to show you that feature. But it'll come. OK. So there's a lot of mileage you get out of this. This thing is shortening the browser height. So I need to also do that in order to show you the other bits. OK. So there's another one of these kind of spaced rays here. And I'm using it to kind of grab this whole region and kind of lay it out on the screen, to pin it down the middle. So that's kind of a thing that it does. OK, next thing I want to show you is this margin component. So I've got a button. And inside it, I've got two margin components that are kind of nested in each other. And this is not very pretty, but I've got this draggable handle. Like we can set it's actually a third margin component on the edge of the screen. So we can go and drag that and resize our window, right? Or the kind of form that's inside there. And so if you notice, this thing up here is also a spaced ray. I'm going to refresh so I can kind of reset that state. So I'll hit the double margin, kind of do that. And this is all done with idiomatic React, props flowing through, local state for some of the editing controllers and things like that. It's not actually all that hard to do. It just so there's a whole thing that we kind of I built and made hang together. OK, so let's see. Vertically, you can set negative margins, and if you set a negative box, the button disappears. Let's see. So we can kind of go and twist that thing around. All right. So now to a slightly more complicated example. I've got drag and drop. I promised that in the talk. So what this is some rectangles. And this is meant to demo that two events, one rectangle kind of problem. And so right there, I've got two squares, and I'm clicking on them and dragging it all through. And you notice that kind of popped into the corresponding colored box. It's just the way the demo works. I made it so you can go and kind of do a pretty little kind of snap it into the thing. But if you want to see how these would really get used, you've been watching them get used this whole time. All these little boxes are actually the same code. It's the same component doing all of this dragging stuff. OK, so I'm going to go and seat all of these over there. Boy, there's got to be something I'm forgetting to say about this. Well, next thing is a text demo. So this is sort of a challenge. I just had to do a thing recently where I needed to get CSS to do this little thing where you've got these little, I'm not sure if they're quite visible. Let me try to increase the screen size. You can zoom into it. And anyway, you got these little numbers with stuff in them, and they're styled a certain way. So this system, I think the coolest thing I could show you is you could take the spaced array that has those little the little number things on them, and you could drag that out and separate it. So I'm going to go and just pull that way off at a different angle here, and just start resizing the text and getting it to reflow. And if you notice, it causes those other dots to reflow down their array, which is a really cool thing. So if I go and reset that, I can even go and I can take that intersection between these two lines, and I can lay them out and move them around and stuff. And this is not something you'd really want to do necessarily, but I really think that designers should get direct manipulation over their user interfaces. We shouldn't be wasting our lives coding these things that machines should be doing for us. OK, what's another thing? You can, we have this inner margin. See this little bug here in the corner? You might see the text is not getting measured correctly, so it's not wrapping quite right. That's one of those things. Don't use this yet. Wait till next spring.
Thanks for telling us your bugs.
So yes, they're all my bugs. So anyway, that thing's kind of cool, and you can even see that the margin. I've got that yellow container on the side. It's resetting some of the state, but it keeps some of it. Whatever it can keep, it tries to. OK, last little bit of the demo here is an address form. So here I've got yet another spaced array with some components in it. And I've got this outer one that's kind of setting the distance between the bar on the top, the button bar, and these other things. So let's see. I can go and flip my form around and do whatever I want. Maybe you don't want to do that all the time, but it's a thing that the system can do. And the obvious next step here is to make this thing have a control where you can change the spacing on that and just change the prop that goes into it. There's a lot of mileage you can get out of a spaced array because you can compose most interfaces out of this and maybe a couple of other things. Let's see, we even have this the margin component. There's a little demo in there. So the idea is you kind of draw your application, you lay out a skeleton that controls the negative space in your application. And then you can take, there should be a thing, like a bar full of, a tool palette where you have your controls, like inputs and things like that, and you drag and drop those inputs onto that skeleton. I think that's a really nice way to do it. It's very different than this whole, let's subdivide the world into a bunch of boxes and then somehow make it look like what Paul wanted. OK, one last little technical thing. I'll reset that state, go back to the address form. I just thought this was really cool. I've got scrolling text. And if we drill in here and you inspect the DOM, this is going to be hard to show because the screen is kind of weird. I think I can do it. Did I just break my... Scroll isn't working. OK. There it goes. OK, so the browser isn't doing this. I wrote a pile of code that takes arbitrary text as a prop, and it calculates all of the line widths and where it's supposed to wrap, and it wraps them. And it's the same thing you saw over here. It's the same code, but here it's hooked up to a scroll event. One of the things you got to do is you've got to make text highlighted, you've got to write your own code to do highlighting. That doesn't come built in either. So this, by the way, breaks all accessibility. There are accessibility APIs coming, this thing called the accessibility DOM. These are all behind feature flags in most of the browsers, the last time I checked. But that is the way forward with this thing, is to hook them up to all of these accessibility APIs so we don't break anybody, because that's not my goal. I want everybody to be able to use this. It just doesn't do it right now. And that's another reason why you should help me fix it instead of trying to use it. OK, anyway, that's kind of a cool demo here. I can show if you drill into these, it has a bunch of text elements, and each one of these represents a line. And if I scroll up here, OK, These things, see, we've got a clip rectangle that's like choosing, like doing the clipping around the thing. If you scroll here, it's actually updating the text and the sizes inside. And it is only drawing the lines that are going to have at least some pixels rendered. So lines outside that will never hit the viewport get clipped out, and they don't even get stuck into the DOM. That's how that thing works. OK. I wanted to add this to the demo, but the last thing I wanted to say is outside of this box model, you can do something way more interesting than CSS grid. Imagine that you've got a line going across the screen at some angle, and you want to place something at the intersection of those two lines. I call them named constructions, and these are a thing that you should be able to do in user interfaces, where you have some kind of dynamic layout flow thing, or changing browser window size, right? And you want things to kind of show up on the screen, and you don't want to do a bunch of work to make boxes do it. There ought to be another way to do it. There's a system I built before this that rendered things into Canvas that did it. But it wasn't built on top of React, and I don't think anybody would want to use it. But anyway, it had this idea in it, and it's the thing I want to do next and bring into this thing. OK, so I've just got a couple of slides, so let me play those. All right. I had some principles in building this thing, and I'm not even sure this is exhaustive, but I wanted to say something about them. So I went into the apps and not documents idea. Here, we're really targeting designers and engineers. And the idea here is we really, like you could go and look at some of the APIs that I've made and say, oh my God, like you're wrangling like all of these different layout widths and different numbers and things like that. And that makes it harder. But the idea here is to build tools and to build editors that are super powerful and let you do all of these wonderful things. And so you don't actually have to sit there and evaluate the code the way you would for something you have to write by hand. OK, so another principle here is a lot of you might have heard of Elm. I think Elm is really cool. This idea of getting rid of these 3 languages, right, and getting back down to 1 is really cool. We lost a lot from the 90s when people used to write apps in Objective-C and C++ and straight C and those things. And that would be a really nice thing to kind of get back to. All right, this fourth point, this idea of separation of controller from view. One of the things that I really hated about the status quo is that you can't, for example, you cannot change the selection color or the way selected text is rendered in a form input. It's just not available to you. I don't think there should be a single part of the user interface that should be locked away from you. And its extension mechanism should be the same for every single controller component you're trying to override. You shouldn't have this, like if you've ever tried to take one of those sliders, right, that you override the styling with in CSS. And you try to make half of it green and the other half gray. And as you slide, the green part gets bigger. Try to do that and support like the evergreen browsers. It's horrible. You can't. So that's where point 4 comes from. This idea of, hey, let's make it so the behavior is in one component, and then the actual rendering is just a function that you pass in, and you both are replaceable. I think that's a really cool idea. And this last point about regularity in the core API, I can't beat the web up so much because they've actually done a pretty good job of taking like CSS and HTML and these things and building on them. But when you start from scratch, you want things to be orthogonal and nice, and you want a thing that you learn early on to keep building so things are good. All right, so we're getting very near the end. Future steps. That's a Beatles joke. So things I have to do. So there's more layout components. I talked about this idea of something that's way more flexible than grid and gives you some of those things. There's more editing kind of improvements. The editor is just kind of like a couple of months ago, I was so excited about it. I stayed up till, what, 10? And like midnight working on this thing. And there's more editing things that you should be able to do. It should be eventually something as good as like a real design tool like Sketch or Illustrator. And And yet the same thing, like there's no reason why the editor can't be baked into the same thing. Editing should just be a mode. Like this idea of the web, like having like a thing where you're creating the content and consuming it is kind of cool. And there's no reason not to have that. Okay, and I'm not the only person that's ever tried to build a thing. There's actually a couple of startups that have built a similar thing, but they're commercial ventures. This is like a, I guess I'm picking a license now. It's an MIT license project now. And what those guys did is basically built a separate backend. So you can go and have this thing that keeps your abstract vector illustration or UI, and it'll go and generate code that targets like Canvas or SVG or even CSS. So that's a really good idea, and that's something this tool should definitely do. That's one way of solving accessibility, for example, is not actually sticking with SVG. Or another way you could go is you could use this and say, I've got a little widget that needs to do some SVG stuff, and I'll use this to do my SVG UI and make it interactive, and it'll be easier than writing my own thing. That's not a bad outcome either. You don't have to use this thing to build your entire UI. Okay, further, you could build a compositor and take that away from the browser and say, all right, I don't want you touching my shapes. There's plenty of things that you can't currently do. Like with SVG, there's these like beautiful little kind of blendy things that Illustrator can do. I don't think SVG has, maybe it does. I haven't looked. Don't hold me to that. Another thing is a lot of these components, you could rewrite them in Rust or something else and do a WebAssembly thing with it. There's not a lot of performance benefits. Well, some you would get, especially if you do this with a compositor. Another thing that I hate is well, Electron. This idea that you've got to give somebody a 90 megabyte download to run your web app. Oh, I've got to wrap up. This is a much simpler API. You could build a much smaller runtime and make much nicer apps that aren't huge downloads, and it wouldn't take an 18-core Mac Pro to just run VS Code and Atom and Slack all at the same time. And finally, this last point is that you could build a linter that would actually check and make sure you're not using web APIs that would make that hard to do. So that's the GitHub repo. This thing is a total prototype. There's 2 tests on it. I brought up a couple of tests to screenshot the thing in Puppeteer. It doesn't do much. It does the demo I just showed. And the idea here is to make this thing a thing we use to kind of invent I'm not actually sure how this is going to work all the way. It works well enough, and I'm excited about it, and I think it's good enough to show. But so don't judge this as you might like some project that you would actually use. That's all. And so I'll leave it at that. Any questions? First?
Yeah, do you foresee any challenges with like scraping or automated browser testing?
Well.
Repeat the question.
Okay, yeah. So the question is, are there any challenges with scraping or automated browser testing? So yes, if you're trying to do some Selenium thing, this would be really hard because the 2 tests I wrote on this are move the cursor to this part of the screen, click on the thing, hold it down, drag those little rectangles, and drop them, and then take a screenshot. So if you're trying to get more involved, the current SVG rendering story with it is great because you can put IDs in there. You can go and use all the tricks you know to get stuff in the DOM the way you do, and all that works. But where I wanted to go, I think it would be I wanted to do this to get this ready in time for the talk, to actually have it render the SVG markup. JS.DOM, there were some issues getting JS.DOM to do it. But then to take that markup and then send it into there's tools written in a bunch of other languages that will take arbitrary SVG and render it. C++ libraries and things like that that'll do it. And I thought it would be really cool to actually get away from such a large API and make it so you could do testing without a browser and without Chrome, like the headless Chrome stuff. Be really cool. So yeah, it makes it harder and easier. There's another question?
Yeah. So you kind of addressed this in one of your slides, but I definitely had some experience building websites with like WebGL, like in like a game engine or something. What kind of led you to picking SVG specifically as like your rendering engine? Have you kind of considered using like multiple technologies for this out, like
yes,
for like text and more like an SVG for like shape?
Yes, that in principle the thing you're okay. Oh, right. The question is like, have I considered using other things, not just having it all rendered to SVG, but doing sort of a pastiche of different things, a kind of a mix and match thing. There's no reason why you couldn't, when this thing ships into a production thing that people will use, there's no reason why you couldn't embed it into a piece. But yeah, there's no reason why, if you're very careful about it, why you couldn't do some mixing and matching, especially if you're trying to blend things like. Well, the difficulty is, what kind of guarantees do you want to give to the engineer using this thing, right? Like, how much do you want to hold their hand? And there's a ragged edge there. So if I'm willing to let people make it render to whatever they want, maybe we'll find a way to make it support multiple backends and all have the regions on the screen where they do that. It shouldn't be impossible. I don't know.
All right. We're going to call it there. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks.